All right, why don't we get started? We can um, get started while the rest of the attendees are logging on, but it is 3 minutes after 4 o'clock, so we like to be punctual. Welcome everybody to this webinar at the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention here at Binghamton University. A very special welcome to all of our registered guests and attendees who were here for the last version of this, which was last November, which of course didn't happen because of university-wide technical issues. Those are all corrected, thank goodness. And so we're delighted to have you all back, and we're certainly delighted to have our 4 panelists back who have been generous enough to reschedule and give even more of their time to talk to us today in this panel about transitional justice and atrocity prevention in Colombia. I'm Max Pensky. I'm the co-director of the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention here at Binghamton University and the State University of New York, and I'll be moderating the conversation that we'll be having for the next 90 minutes. A few technical details first for you all. First of all, this webinar is offered in simultaneous English, Spanish translation. If you go to the bottom of your screens for the functions at the bottom, the one on the furthest right, the interpretation icon, which looks like a globe, you can click on that and it will ask you to select a language. You can use that to select the language that you would like to hear people speak in. So if you click Spanish, then everything you will hear will be Spanish. If you click English, everything you will hear will be in English. If you are bilingual and would like to hear everybody speak in the language that they're using, simply leave it alone. Otherwise, you can go ahead and activate that. And a special welcome to our 2 professional translators who are here with us today. You will not be seeing them, but you will be hearing them. They'll be trading off. So there might be a difference in voice every now and again. The other thing to mention, of course, is that as a webinar, we will have a Q&A function activated. That's next to the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. We strongly encourage you to submit your questions to the panelists. You can do that at any time during the course of the conversation. You can, if you would like to direct your question to a specific panelist, please do so. If you'd like a general question, you may do that as well. We would ask that you please identify yourself in your questions so that we know who you are. And then I will read out as many of the questions as we can get to over the course of the hour and a half. If you would like to type a question in Spanish, that is absolutely fine. I will have one of our Spanish-speaking staff read the question out. You definitely do not want to hear me reading the question in Spanish. Much as I'd like to try, I think it would be best if we left that to actual Spanish speakers. So English or Spanish is perfectly fine in the Q&A function. I think that's all of the housekeeping that we need to take care of. Once again, welcome everybody. Let's get started. I have a very short introduction just to say that for those of you who follow the news coming out of Colombia and follow the news of international politics, you'll know that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, released a statement yesterday on the 15th, appealing to the Colombian government to take decisive and substantive steps to address the ever-rising level of atrocity violence that is being carried out in Colombia, targeting a number of groups, but above all, local indigenous groups, human rights defenders, Afro-Colombian groups, and former demobilized FARC members. We want to talk about that violence today. We want to try to understand what's driving it, who are the actors involved, how that violence is and isn't related to Colombia's extraordinarily complicated and innovative final accord, its peace process, which envisioned sweeping reforms to address all the root causes of the 70 years of domestic violence in Colombia. And finally, turn on the practical side to what sort of political and social measures and policies could be identified as promising ways of addressing and stopping this kind of violence. And so I'm going to stop there and briefly introduce our four panelists, all four of whom are internationally recognized experts on Colombian politics in general and on the peace process and the conditions in Colombia in particular. I'm very glad that all four of you have joined us. First, let me introduce to you Nelson Camilo Sanchez, who is on the faculty of law at the University of Virginia Law School, where he is also the director of their International Human Rights Clinic. He has also worked as a consultant legal expert on different human rights organizations, formerly research director for a very well-known Bogota-based NGO, the Center for the Study of Law, Justice and Society, de Justicia. Camilo, thank you so much for joining us, and I should say rejoining us today. Camila de Gamboa is Associate Professor at the Centro de Estudios sobre Conflictos y Paz at the University of Rosario in Bogota. She obtained her law degree there and received her MA and PhD from our own Binghamton University. She's recently finished a book on Colombia and transitional justice and is a member of the General Assembly of la Comisión Colombiana de Juristas. Welcome, Camila. Mariana Casich Peña is a research associate with IFIT, the Institute for Integrated Transitions, where she advises primarily in areas of transitional justice and victims' rights for several projects of the Institute. Before she joined IFIT, Mariana worked with the Colombian government from the Presidential Advisor for Human Rights, the Ministry of Justice and the Victims Unit, where she worked as legal advisor during the negotiations between the government and the FARC and the subsequent implementation phase. Mariana, it's great to have you with us. Finally, Mark Freeman is the founder and executive director of IFIT, based in Barcelona. Before founding IFIT, he served as the chief of external relations at International Crisis Group. Prior to that, he helped launch and direct the ICTJ, the International Center for Transitional Justice in Brussels and New York. He is the author of many, many books and articles, including his most recent book, co-authored book, Negotiating Transitional Justice, which draws on years he worked as an expert advisor inside the Havana-based peace talks between the Colombian government and the FARC-EP. So welcome, panelists. Camila, let me start with you. Tell us a little bit more, if you can, about this new post-peace accord violence. I mean, obviously, since the implementation of the peace accord began in 2016, there has been a transformation in the some changes in the way that violence happens in Colombia. What has changed? What is new? What are you seeing that is different from what it would have been, say, 3 years ago?
Bien, bueno, muchísimas gracias, Max, por esta invitación.
Thank you very much. Max, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. I'd rather speak in Spanish because I think better in Spanish. And it's much easy for me to do so. In any case, I think we need to look at what's happening in Colombia today in a more general historic context. I don't think we can analyze what's happening currently if we do not think about the context of violence that has permeated Colombia for a long time. It began, of course, especially, or at least in the way we've seen it develop from the time in the 50s during the 20th century, where we were talking about violence in Colombia. I think something that's very complex that happens in Colombia, and that is that politics and political things in Colombia has always been defined because of institutional weaknesses, or because there is no political project that unites us as a country beyond the differences that we had at the time between political parties, but which then manifested in other types of violence and interests. I mean that violence has been the way in which we do politics. And this means that not only political parties perpetrated violence during that time, but it also became a way of acting in which many groups, which have very different interests, have, and many times they've been part of the state, but sometimes political parties or social groups then use violence in order to gain their own interests. And that's been a continuum. I'm not saying it's the same type of violence because it would be too simplistic to say that it's been the same kind of violence since then. But this violence is continuous and it exists today. And the peace process, the first negotiating process when Álvaro Uribe Vélez was in presidency, de-escalated violence in some ways because many paramilitaries negotiated with the government and left. And it's not just exclusively then, it began in the 80s, during the 20th century, many presidents have made efforts to try and negotiate with different groups. There are many groups that have separated and withdrew from violence. In some ways, quite successfully in some cases, but still today, the way we do politics, the way we pursue our interests, sometimes it even has to do with money, continues to be the use of political violence. And this is done by politicians and many other social groups. Many times, state agents join paramilitary people and guerrilla to perpetrate. And so it would be naive to think that after the Havana Agreement, which in fact produced this extraordinary moment, people sometimes forget, there was a moment in which violence was deeply de-escalated. I remember this was very, very interesting because we saw the military hospital where soldiers that had been fighting in the war usually go and there was no one in there. There were so many things that happened after the de-escalation of violence, but it doesn't mean that the society as such changed. Mechanisms and ways in which groups behave are still there. Also, we've had negotiation processes with groups, but we haven't done a process post-conflict where there are no armed actors. And the possibility that the groups continue to act or become another type of group or that dissidents begin to act is still there.
Okay,
it's still there. Oh.
Mariana, thank you very much. Mariana, let me turn to you for a moment. Here in the English language press, and we saw it in the text of the UN High Commissioner's release yesterday, we're looking at the targeting of people who are referred to as human rights defenders. Can you explain, can you unpack that term a little bit? Who are, I mean, and we're talking about hundreds of people in the last several years who have been, in many cases, systematically murdered. Can you unpack that term for us a little bit so that we can understand who these people are who are being targeted and perhaps why they're being targeted?
Conversation. Your question, Max, is actually harder and more difficult than it seems, because defining the human rights defenders has many different lines and many different dimensions. But let me to do with the question you asked Camila and some of the elements that she was putting on the table. And it has to do with the fact that in many of the territories where the conflict has been the cruelest and the strongest and at the highest intensity, are at those territories where most of the time the state is absent the state, and even in some occasions, the state is the perpetrator. So with the peace process, there was indeed a change of the dynamics. There was a change of the dynamics because some of those territories were under control of the FARC. And with the lifting of the war with the FARC and their demobilization and their relocation into specific areas, there was a gap of power. And in some of those communities, that meant that people were actually being able to install and to live under their social norms, not the norms imposed by the FARC, but their own social norms. And this also meant that some of the leaders, of the community leaders, managed or were able to gain some visibility, were able to empower themselves and to start to give an impulse and to push forward several community processes that they weren't able to push before. Now, the problem is that in many of those territories, when there's a gap of power, everybody knows this. We knew this, and we talked a lot about this before the demobilization happened. When there is a gap of power, you need to fill that gap immediately. And the state needed to come and to get to those areas as soon as possible, as quickly as possible. And the truth is that in many of those territories, this didn't happen. So what ended up happening in several territories is that those leaders were exposed, they were empowered and they were exposed. And because that vacuum wasn't filled timely appropriate, in a timely manner, and then other groups started to create. And there is of course a lot to be said, and I don't want to get to take too long into answering this first question, Max. But the truth is that those groups, they were new, they were less organized, and they were less stable, and they had less structured norms. So the communities didn't know what to expect. The fights between groups were more often, and in the end, the community leaders or the human rights defenders ended up being completely exposed to those new expressions of violence that are highly unpredictable and highly mutable. So if one group moves, that leader who had to talk with that group because he has to move forward the processes in the communities. And with who do you talk? With the authority that is there in the moment. And if the authority is the armed group, you have to talk with the armed group. If that armed group leaves that territory, then that particular leader is exposed. I would just mention this as a general dynamic because I think most of the, or not most, just several of the cases are because of people, leaders, community leaders, human rights defenders, in the sense of people who promote or look forward or try to push forward the defense of human rights and community initiatives in highly affected territories.
Thank you. And I think it's really important to note the excellent point that you just made, that in a negotiated peace accord, part of the process of demobilization can often be the creation of that vacuum of, if not political authority, then armed authority, which has I guess the foreseeable but unintended consequence of making local agency more visible than it would have been, and more visible also presumably means more vulnerable. I wanted to turn to Camilo for a moment and turn now from the victim group to the perpetrator groups. I mean, Mariana has talked about the emergence of new groups and the transformation of older ones. We've heard a little bit about this idea of BACRIM, which is, I guess, a shortened word of bandas criminales, or a sort of a catch-all word for groups that may not be state actors, may not be parts of armed groups, may be descendants from the old auto defense forces. Talk to us, Camilo. I mean, one of your areas of expertise really has to do with land. and land reform. Talk to us a little bit about how this plays out in terms of these new criminal groups, hardly rebel groups, but criminal groups. What are their incentives for engaging this kind of violence based on the idea of both land reform and of the final accord's great emphasis on coca crop reduction or coca crop elimination?
Gracias, Max. Yo creo que hay distintas razones. En primer lugar,
several reasons. First of all, there's still a great dispute about legal and illegal uses of land, which in these territories where there was a conflict existed. Usually there was the monopoly of an armed actor, sometimes the guerrilla, or who was in command. So these groups have this territory in dispute. We can see this in drug trafficking routes, cocaine crops, illegal mining of non-renewable natural resources, but also regarding other ways of land exploitation. For instance, with one of the consequences of the withdrawal of the FARC is that there are new processes of mining, investment in mining resources open up. And as Camila and Mariana were saying, this is normally associated to logics of violent disputes of how to have access to these resources and how to gain control of them. So this is something that gives rise to endless violence cycles. Secondly, the intervention itself of transitional justice on land has generated disputes about who are seeking to gain back their land, of those who own currently the lands and they don't want to give them back, or they don't want to fulfill the findings. There's been violence against those who have led this process of restitution of land. The victims have received violence. There are very difficult cases in which there is a huge vulnerability of victims that seek their land, but what we call the third parties who are occupying those lands as very vulnerable communities, in many cases that have been brought to those territories by armed groups in which there are very conflicting dynamics in the communities. On the other hand, the lack of fulfilling from the state of its agreements. For instance, the agreements with the cocaine communities, all the social offer of seed capital and other ways of being able to achieve maintenance in order not to have to do cocaine crops. And this has not happened, which has led violence and to the pursuit, senseless pursuit to reactivate glyphosate aerial route. And this has generated huge consequences, lack of trust in the state, which leads to rejecting the state in some territories. And the privatization of the resolution of these conflicts is much more appealing for many communities rather than the state justice offer.
Thank you, Camilo. I mean, so turning to Mark for a moment, Mark, you are not just a practitioner of transitional justice who was personally deeply involved in the protracted and largely secret Havana negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC that led to this path-breaking 2016 final accord. you're also a theorist of transitional justice, and particularly transitional justice measures that arise from negotiated peace settlements. So hearing your colleagues talk about the nature of this downstream violence, we're now 4 years out from the signing of the final accord. One thing I really wanted to ask you to talk to us about is, I'll put it this way. One of the things that international observers most admired and were about the final accord was its comprehensiveness, the way that it systematically and in a very conscious way decided to address and come up with policy responses for all the major drivers of the long-term conflict. I wanted to talk to you about whether, in your experience, the design of the final accord took into account, and how it took into account, how difficult the implementation of these really structural, comprehensive reforms would be, and whether there was concern that failure to implement one or more of these components would result in the effective the effective failure, frankly, of the peace accord as a whole. I mean, that's a rather sweeping way to ask you for your views, but I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Great. Well, thank you, Max. I mean, I want to actually just point out before answering your question more in a more detailed way, that what you described as a path-breaking accord was rejected by the Colombian public.
Yes.
Yes, it was a narrow defeat. Yes, there were some dirty tactics, etc. It was rejected, and so that so it's a system that certainly met a fair amount of skepticism when it was put to the voters, but it was also preceded by a reality of extremely high polarization around the choice to negotiate with the FARC in the first place. So, I mean, when you take account of the kinds of factors that Camila and Camilo and Mariana have discussed, you know, which describe, I think, structural conditions in a sort of ecosystem that permits violence to continue, at times to escalate, at times to de-escalate, depending on how different parts are moved around, whether the state is present, what local, effectively kind of warlord might be in a particular place. All those variables move around, but we were conscious of all this, I suppose. I mean, when inside of the talks between the government and the FARC, of course, there was an agenda that from the outset, the agenda that was announced in 2012, when it was revealed to the public for the first time that the Colombian government was sitting down with the FARC and they were planning to negotiate a peace settlement. The controversy began immediately. I think most of the listeners probably are aware of former President Uribe and his following and the way he commands. I mean, he commands a significant part of throughout this period of public opinion. So the environment, let's just say, I mean, it's hard for me. I'm just mentioning those to say that I don't think anyone in the talks thought that there was a technical fix to this.
Right.
The politics ran throughout it. There was no way to solve it. I mean, if the country was going to remain split after a peace accord, it was extremely unlikely. I mean, more or less impossible that the deal could be implemented. It was already foreseeable, you could say, that even as the ink was drying on the deal, which what included, as you mentioned, a comprehensive transitional justice system and all these other things, rural reforms, the crop substitution scheme, disarmament, not least, and of course, political participation for the FARC. I mean, even as the ink was drying on that deal, before it got rejected in the plebiscite and had to get renegotiated and so forth, that it was entirely possible that a government that was hostile to this deal would be elected 2 years after it was signed, and would seek to tear it apart. I mean, we were that conscious of how polarized the situation was. So there was no way, I suppose in that sense, I'd say that no one had a romantic view of this deal. I don't think the government delegation or the FARC delegation did, but the parties really did, I think, manage to achieve really important breakthroughs. It was, if you ask the sides, I think in 2012, what the 2016 deal might look like if it took that long. And of course, in the beginning, they didn't think it would. It took years rather than the months that they hoped it would take. I think they would all probably acknowledge, with maybe just a few exceptions, that it was extraordinary how much the text contemplated, how comprehensive it was, how systemic it was. But successful implementation was going to require a minimum public consensus. It needed the blessing of the referendum, and it didn't get that. And there was just, I think, while there have been extraordinary efforts in some ways by people in civil society, by some people in government, certainly, civil servants, some of the officials that manage these institutions of transitional justice, at least on that particular component of it, and notwithstanding the fact that it was one of the most successful disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration processes of modern times for its speed, and I would also say its high level of compliance. And you had a UN Security Council resolution, you had all these things, but the country's completely split, not on anything, on this deal. So it was just, I mean, we could have left, the mortals who were in the process could have left it to the gods to design it, but it was going to come down to politics and a minimum sense of consensus and unity, and a minimally shared narrative about why the implementation of this deal would be good for the country. And nothing could be further from that reality, unfortunately. And again, we were conscious that everything to some extent would hang on the result of that referendum. Once it had decided it was going to take place, that was absolutely critical. It would have made it very difficult. A positive result would have made it very difficult for future governments, right, left, or center, to overturn it. But that did not happen.
No, and I think a lot of the international surprise at the referendum, which the Santos administration, I think, was quite sure that it would win, really reflects what you're saying here in the United States, where we're speaking from. We know a thing or two about political polarization more than we did in 2016 as well. And so the one question I'd like to ask all of the panelists, just sort of take your turns, is what now? I mean, we have good reason to think that the Duque administration not only suffers from the lack of state capacity, especially in rural areas that Camila was describing in the beginning, but continues Uribe's open hostility toward implementation of the terms of the accord. The question now is, you don't have crystal balls to see what is going to be next in the next 12 to 36 months of Colombian politics. But if you did have one, what do you think you might see? I mean, given the fact that the implementation is stalled, and given the fact that groups and populations are stalled, that the implementation has run up against very foreseeable headwind. Yeah. What do you think is likely to happen next? I mean, in the next couple of years, if, for example, the Conservative Party remains in power, if there's a political transition, is there both will and capacity to, in the specific sense, address the question of atrocity violence in these territories against these targeted groups. So maybe we'll start then once again with Camila, and we'll just go in the same order if you don't mind.
Bien.
Okay, well,
Como tú dices, es bien
it's
complicado como
very complicated,
pensar
as
como
you
en
said, to think
ser como un poco adivino respecto de esto.
or try
Pero
and
yo quisiera
guess about this
señalar
or look at a crystal
que
ball. But I do
esto
want to
es
point
algo
out
que ocurre
that this is something that happens in every country which has had a process of transitional justice. We're not in a situation or an experience that's completely different than all the other transitional justice models in other nations that have dealt with this. If you study the processes of transitional justice in, say, in the 80s in Central America or in Southern Cone, or even in South Africa, which is always the paradigm of the model for transitional justice, some are using this model, in fact, to address conflicts that are still present, such as in Colombia, and thinking about Germany even. The two transitional justice processes after the Second World War and during German unification. They've been through this situation. We're not the only ones. However, obviously, there are times in which political contexts are fertile and they allow for models to be developed and you make some important progress. So you can say this happened during the Santos government. It was possible then to do something that seemed impossible in Colombia, which was to really sit down at the negotiating tables and bring an armed group such as the FARC, which, when it first pronounced itself publicly, when the process had begun, said they were not going to subject themselves to a transitional justice process. But what was most extraordinary then is that if you look at the agreement, especially about victims, it's all written with a human rights perspective. It's a comprehensive and transitional justice model, which is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
We have a transitional justice system that is working. There are a number of ex-combatants that, in fact, are in favor of what's happening, who are in the special jurisdiction for peace. The Truth Commission is working and doing its job. The unit to find disappeared people is also functioning. So we cannot look at this as if it's total darkness or fantastic light. You must look at it with shades. There are some gray areas and that there are some less gray areas. And I think that's where we need to look at it from. We need to understand that this is a process. We have previous experience that may help us understand what we need to do and say, but it's a difficult time. However, it will probably pass and things will change and there'll be different contexts. And there's something quite interesting about Colombia. The civil rights movement, the human rights movement, and the amount of people who in Colombia think about the model of the agreement is incredible. And that's very hopeful. I believe that's incredibly, deeply hopeful. I teach postgrad and pre-doctorate. And when I see my students, when I see these extraordinary people, like Camilo, Mariana, and Mark, who are working on this, then you think there is hope for sure. And that's how you have to look at it, because if you look at it as if this government doesn't agree, then it's impossible to move forward.
Thank you.
But you need to move forward, never mind the difficult situation we're experiencing.
Thank you. Mariana, I'd love to hear from you too.
It did sound very heavy on very existentialist, and I was also thinking, I would like to echo some of the messages that Camila gave, because it is true that we have so many challenges. which are not extraordinary from other contexts that are trying to overcome long periods of massive and systematic and generalized violence. And we do have huge challenges, and we do have currently an administration that opposed the peace agreement. However, there is a fraction in the government that is committed to its implementation. And in that sense, even if it's not as some of us imagined how the comprehensive rural reform should happen, but I guess Camilo can address that point more in detail. But we do have some commitment in that regard. And there are some advances in that regard. And we just had the renewal of the victims law, which is the law that aims to address the harms caused during the conflict and to give comprehensive reparation to victims. We have all the entities from the comprehensive victims installed. And to answer your question more concretely, what do we foresee for the next few months? I personally, the next few months are going to be decisive. The next year, we're going to have the final report from the Truth Commission. And so I guess what we're going to see is a huge, there was already a huge amount of mobilization that happened this year of the Truth Commission calling different sectors to sit and talk and listen, which in my opinion is huge, because our Truth Commission is different from other truth commissions. It wasn't created with the idea of there's a context of generalized impunity. Let's create the Truth Commission to try and address and compensate for that. No, our Truth Commission was created with the goal of also calling for a national dialogue and calling for people to listen and to understand and to try to understand also the gray areas of the conflict. But also, just I think it was yesterday or the day before, I've been seeing these news lately, and every time I see them, I'm like, this is peace. This is what we should all be looking, reading, talking about. The Unit for the Search of the Missing, which is one of the entities created with the peace agreement, found a mother and a daughter that were looking for each other because they were separated when the daughter was just a child because of the armed conflict. And they were separated and they didn't know of each other. They didn't know anything of each other. They couldn't find each other for more than 30 years. And because of this unit and because of these efforts and because of peace, the opportunities that peace brings, that family is now reunited. Yeah. So what do I foresee in the next few months? More of that, more of family being reunited, more of people finding or being able to bury their loved ones. And finally, I also foresee.
Y por fin también prevé.
We already have 7 prioritized cases, macro cases, which we call here in Colombia, macro cases that aim to address really the huge patterns of victimization and criminality that happened during the conflict. So understanding the policies of kidnapping undertaken by the FARC during the conflict, or understanding what we call here in Colombia as false positive, and understanding what were those extrajudicial killings, what is it that caused them, and why were there so many of those. So what I foresee in the next few months is that we're going to start having the public hearings. Until now, the procedures have been closed and have been reserved. We're going to start having public hearings, and these, I'm convinced, is going to be of huge importance. Colombia needs to know. The Colombians and people from Bogota, people from the cities who have not suffered directly the consequences of the conflict, or at least haven't seen it so closely. And this is a possibility for people to understand and to promote a little bit of empathy and understanding the costs of war. And I do believe that the more we understand the costs of war, the more we understand what the consequences it brings, and the closer we are also to avoiding its repetition. I don't want to sound extremely naive, but that is an intervention from an optimistic point of view.
Thank you. So but I'm going to turn to Camilo for a moment to weigh in. I also have a number of questions from the audience that I'd like to turn to. And I also wanted, if we can, to bring back the discussion to the concrete question of what kind of measures can the political authority take now in the short term that would satisfy the UN High Commissioner's demands to take practical steps to address the atrocity violence, in particular that's being visited on Indigenous people, Afro-Colombians, and others and campesinos in these rural areas. So Camilo, please take a few moments and then we're going to turn to some questions from the audience.
Muy bien. Tengo poco que agregar a mis
Okay,
colegas.
I have very little to add to my colleagues. I share their vision completely. I believe that the peace accord, more than a contract, is rather like a route. And I believe that it has to give us the possibility to make progress regarding some goals, and that's going to have some future goals and disputes. These need to be with a democratic approach. The final goal that we were pursuing with the peace negotiation. Therefore, I believe that what the sectors need to do that agree with the peace is to fulfill these goals. The transitional justice mechanisms need to do their job. We need to accompany them in order for them to do the job the best possible way so that we can have a consensus on achieving all the issues or some of them, most of them. I believe that that's the way in which we can resolve some of the issues that we've had in these past years. I believe that is key to avoid the strategy of the foundational myth, meaning that the opponents of the accord have seen it as a basic myth of the country, or of the foundational myth. Nothing that happens now is the lack of governability from the state. It's just what we have inherited the peace from peace accord. So in all aspects, more or less, it's like the same theory of I won by a lot, they stole the election, without any evidence, with no capacity to understand or explain, because that was the political platform, kind of like the political platform of the opponents to the accord. And I believe that that's a strategic mistake on behalf of those who support the accord, is to just continue with this argument. I believe that what we need to seek is implementation and to avoid controversy. In answering some of the questions that I read, I believe that the drug global policies are very important for the future of the peace in Colombia and the agreement with the FARC.
Oh,
Colombia by itself.
Let me stop you right there, Camilo, because I'd like to read that question out loud to our audience. So thank you, Camilo, and let's do just that now. Let's turn to the first of our audience questions. This first question comes from Ernesto Cardenas, and he writes, "The success of the Colombian peace building process cannot be seen as a domestic policy issue alone. In fact, it depends crucially on global political economy issues, such as the orientation of global policies toward the problem of drug trafficking. In general, it can be said that policies for fighting illegal crops in Colombia are implemented without addressing seriously the demand side of the problem. Is it possible," and here's the question part, "is it possible for Colombia, a country with low international political power, to change the global view of the drug trafficking problem?" So Camilo, you were in the middle of addressing that very question when I cut you off, so apologies for that, but please do go ahead.
Colombia no puede cambiar la política global.
Colombia cannot change the global politics, but Colombia can be an important actor in the change of policy, starting from its own experience. And I believe that the accord had a roadmap that was very clear, based on evidence of what has not worked in global drug politics and policies, and also regarding Colombia in order to undertake other paths. A couple of weeks ago, there was a report in the US Congress where they assessed the plan of security and foreign aid to Colombia, the so-called Colombia plan. And the commission concluded that it was a complete failure if the goal was to get rid of drugs. Therefore, I believe that it's necessary to have this discussion, but without an international radical change, Colombia could really make a lot of progress just by fulfilling the accord. It would be much easier to have a different conversation at a global level. And I believe that there are opportunities for that. And Colombia could be one of the countries with the biggest legitimacy without the pain of the illegal drugs in these last decades. But beyond that, Colombia could have great opportunities to achieve some progress. For instance, prohibition of aerial aspersion of glyphosate, and also local opportunities for manual eradication, accompanied by social processes at a social and cultural level geared towards communities. Also the subject of how the justice apparatus is concentrated and focused on forbidden issues and what should be forbidden, what should be prosecuted, what should be allowed and regulated. So there are different phases in which Colombia could really contribute for its own benefit and for a better conversation in the world.
Thank you. Mark, you're the only panelist who's a non-Colombian. What's the view from Barcelona on that particular issue?
Because I strongly agree with what Camilo is saying. I would, however, I would relativize, I would reduce, let's say, the importance of the resolution of that for all the factors that are needed to end violence and break the cycles of conflict in the country. I think it's actually, it's certainly an important factor, but I think there are far too many variables of far too much impact to expect that even with dramatic transformation in the global approach to drugs, that the end of conflict would be near, unless all those other pieces, there's so many, would need to be resolved. And sometimes it's just, you just have the bad luck of being beside a neighbor that's falling apart, like Venezuela. I mean, has a little bit to do with drug policy there, but not so much. And Colombia and the problems that produces for ending conflict, reducing violence, et cetera. There's just too many other independent variables. That was, I guess, what I would say. So, and I do think in that sense, that's part of what I think Colombia could bring is to put in context both what is to be gained, but also not why it's achievable. I think, again, Colombia has certainly a unique perspective and a lived experience that needs to be heard by all serious policymakers when it comes to that issue.
Thank you. Turning once again to the question of targeted groups. I mean, one of the things that we've read about here in the United States is representatives of Indigenous people or of or the higher leadership of former FARC members asking the Colombian government for protection. And one of the things that has been quite interesting for to us has been that the indigenous groups have been pressing the Colombian government not to think of protection merely in terms of protecting individual persons. That's certainly absolutely important to have some degree of physical security. But one of the discourses that's been arising is indigenous groups pressing the Colombian government to think about protection in a different and broader sense of protection, not only of groups, but also protection of habitat, protection of rivers, protection of indigenous land. Do you think that, I mean, presumably the Duque administration, which has barely agreed to meet with indigenous leaders in the capital, presumably they're not going to be swayed by these kinds of arguments that the whole idea of protecting of vulnerable groups needs to be expanded. Have you found it, is there do you sense that there's a conversation happening in Colombian civil society that indigenous groups have become more visible and are pressing for a certain kind of redefinition of some of these political terms? That question can go to anybody who would like to take it. I'm sorry, my questions tend to be very long. I'm very sorry about that, but I can't seem to help myself. I'm too late to change. Brianna, would you like to handle that one, or to talk to us a little bit about how the post-accord political landscape has changed things for indigenous groups in the way that they might think about their own role as political actors?
Yo diría,
I would say not so much this last negotiation process. I believe this is a strengthening process of the people and their leadership during the past years that started, I believe, very strong in 91 with the Constitution of 91 and its acknowledgement, and that has gained a lot of impulse thanks to its tenacity enduring the war, and I believe also the historical discrimination that exists in Colombia.
fue la discusión sobre si aceptar o no reparaciones.
The discussion on whether or not they accepted reparation for the facts of the conflict, because initially the indigenous leaders believed that could be a trap because violence against them, the taking of their land, had been much longer than 30 years, which are the 30 years of conflict. They did not want to subordinate, they did not want to forget their reclamation of violence accumulated for 500 years for today's reparations, because transitional justice for us is not good. We have vindication of justice, historic vindication of justice, which is why these are two different things. After much dialogue, they've begun to join the conversation. And in terms of reparation, they have a different law. It says specifically, because there were two things that were extremely important for indigenous peoples leaders. First, it should always say that if there were reparation, transitional reparation, that would not erase their legitimate historical claim. And two, their right would be considered in every step taken for reparation or justice, and their system of rights, judicial pluralism, was going to be included, and that it somewhat had some legitimacy. And we see this today still. I think the de-FARCization, and I apologize for to the interpreters for this, to stop calling the all Colombian problems FARC has been very important for social movements, and the main social movement in Colombia in many territories is the indigenous movement. So 5-10 years ago, the indigenous movement organized and protested, and people talked about them as if the FARC went out to demonstrate. But without the FARC today, then now the media says the indigenous people are protesting. And I think that was important. And it's important not just because it legitimizes it, but because this has the capacity to create more strength in it, in the movement itself. I saw something quite beautiful a year ago in terms of the protests that were more by people, more civil ones. Before the pandemic, Colombia was experiencing a lot of social movement. People were out on the street, and we had demonstrations. These demonstrations were taking place for several days, and when it lasts so long, people lose strength, and then things are not as peaceful. But at one point, the indigenous guards came from Cauca to Bogota by bus at a time when there had been so much violence committed, and this guard came, and some sectors of the society have a lot of respect for these guards. And this happened again when La Guardia, they're called, comes to Bogota because the president decides not to receive them in their territory. So they come to Bogota, and the city receives them in an acknowledgement, an important acknowledgement gesture. And to me, that is peace. This is what we were fighting towards, for movements to raise their voice and participate in the political game, to say, I am here, and this is what I want, and this is what I need, which is not necessarily exclusively a product or an outcome of the peace process, because it also has to do with resilience and organizational capacity by the indigenous movement, but mostly because we de-FARCized the political public agenda in Colombia.
Would anyone else like to follow up on that?
In Max, if you want, but just to say perhaps two very brief things, because I think Camilo was very thorough, and I very much enjoyed his answer. But just to also mention, since also Camilo was addressing the idea of reparation, because the empowerment of civil society, and I started saying this last time we got together for this same webinar, and how when the victims law came, and the collective reparations started to happen, and this came along with a very important strengthening of civil society in Colombia, and actually looking at the strengthening or the empowerment of ethnic, not only indigenous groups, but ethnic groups, including the Afro-Colombian people and the Rum, the Gypsies, for the making of the victims law. Each of the ethnic population in Colombia had their own law decree that would be able to adjust whatever provisions were established in the victims law to their own traditions and cultures. And today you talk to them and they have their decree, and they believe that this is absolutely appropriated and empowered by them. And I think that if you want to create an impact and to have positive impacts, you do need citizenship from wherever to believe in those norms. So I do think that those types of procedures of transitional justice mechanisms, even those that pre-existed at the peace agreement, were very important to the strengthening of and the empowering of indigenous and other ethnical groups in Colombia, but also of communities of peasants in the different territories. And the second thing I would perhaps mention is that the ethnic empowerment in Colombia also allowed for them to have a strong voice finally in what was the peace agreement, and for them to have a chapter, a specific chapter on ethnics and on the ethnicities and how the different provisions should be interpreted for the sake of implementation. And it is because of this that today, for example, the very selection of the judges of the special jurisdiction for peace took into account the different, we call these in Colombia the ethnic and differential approaches, gender approaches, ethnic approaches, and differential approaches. But also the fact that the different entities, when working, they do have to have teams that acknowledge the customs and traditions of those of the indigenous people and other ethnicities here in Colombia, and whatever needs to be implemented is to also be agreed upon with them. And just finally, one last note, because what was created in Havana is a comprehensive system of transitional justice, of course, but it is a comprehensive system of transitional justice guided by a paradigm of restorative justice. And this is largely also based on what has been the special jurisdiction of the indigenous people. Because in general, the way they administer justice is also based on restorative justice criteria. So a lot is being done right now, and when we're looking at, how should these special sanctions be designed and so on and so forth, a lot is being done looking at what has been done in those traditional ways of administering justice by indigenous people here in Colombia.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to another audience question now. This one is from our own colleague, Carrie Wiggum, who is the Assistant Professor of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention here at Binghamton University. And he asks, can you speak about the lessons learned so far in the DDR process, that's disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration? Have there been any aspects that have been successful? What are the factors, political but also social, that account for so many ex-guerrillas taking up arms again? I can't resist asking Mark to start us off here, because, and for the only reason, and I'd like to hear from others, for the only reason that as I read Carrie's question, I had a very vivid memory of from my little room in Bogota, where I was just about to go on a trip to visit one of these zones, concentration zones, as they were rather unfortunately named, to observe the DDR in action. And I would say, and Mark was very helpful as always, but at the time he was very helpful in making me vividly aware of two things that I needed to know. One, I should expect a rather modest government presence, despite its assurances. And two, I should never underestimate how much the FARC was hated by so many of the Colombian people. And I'm actually quite surprised by the relative success of the DDR program in Colombia, but I wanted to start with Mark and say, what do you make in responding to Carrie's question, what are the lessons learned about DDR that you think are generalizable outside of the Colombian context in what Camilo referred to as the defarcization of Colombia. Or getting Colombia unfarking itself up, you might say.
Right. So no, the DDR is quite an interesting chapter of this whole story. I mean, I think, again, first, it's important to recognize that Colombia had pretty vast experience. I mean, Camila gave some examples in her first intervention of just how many peace processes had preceded this, with how many groups. There was also the paramilitary demobilization, even before the negotiation with the FARC, which was already the fourth a formal attempt to negotiate a comprehensive settlement. Even then, there was a disarmament law, you could say, where FARC, or really any illegally, forget the exact term in Spanish, but let's say illegal non-state armed actor could voluntarily demobilize. There was a whole scheme for that. But it's remarkable, I think, in the sense that, I mean, I can tell you a couple examples. First, it was certainly the red line, from my perspective, of the Colombian government. There was no way in hell, literally, that the Colombian government would sign a deal that did not involve basically immediate and rapid disarmament by the FARC. They could never, like, you would never, it was unsellable. It was impossible. Now, on the FARC side, obviously, their starting point was, we're not defeated. You couldn't beat us. You know, you may have had the upper hand at crucial times, including at the time of the negotiation, but we are arriving here as undefeated. And so even, I mean, some of the intriguing little details from the DDR negotiation even have to do with their resistance to the expression DDR. They also didn't want to have anything to do, for example, with the DDR concept that was applied to the paramilitaries, their arch enemies in some ways. So they wanted their own DDR scheme, and that was part of what had to be negotiated. And that DDR scheme, as you might expect, reflected a mix of past lessons from the demobilization experience of Colombia itself, obviously to some extent the sort of international practices and so forth. And then it also had to do with the balancing act in the negotiation itself between what minimally the government was going to require and so forth. So, but what I would say is this: I mean, it happened more quickly than probably many people anticipated for a number of reasons. I would say. I mean, there are many, but I'll just mention a couple. One key component was that it was negotiated between combatants, if you like. The actual DDR scheme was reached between state agents from the armed forces, et cetera, of the Colombian government and the, let's say, the combatant side of FARC, because obviously not everybody in FARC, some of them were sort of more diplomat-like, if you can imagine. It's sort of a different concept. But they contemplated, for example, the UN's role. I mean, it could have been another third party, but having a third party verification scheme was important. There were different mechanisms that they created in which there were FARC and government representatives sort of moving things along. I would say in a certain way, it turned out to be a virtue that they didn't try and solve every single detail of the implementation of DDR, but rather created mechanisms that would solve problems on the go. And I think that also helped. There is also, I mean, there's a component here as well, I believe, that you had to build in incentives for them to disarm and demobilize. Although, again, that was not the term they used. I'm just using it for purposes of this conversation. They had to basically transit to legality, was kind of the expression that was used after they disarmed. But what was in it for the leaders, of course, was the chance to participate in politics, unarmed. What was in it was the chance for legal leniency if they met the conditions attached to disarmament, which included, I mean, if they wanted to get the most favorable or least punitive legal treatment, disarmament was one of the preconditions, along with truth and other things and so forth. So they had building in incentives, what the literature would call commitment mechanisms, was also very important in the design and ultimately part of the successful implementation. And then the other part that people don't like to talk about very much, but the fact that they actually weren't demobilized, but actually were cohesive and intact at the moment when the process began was fundamental. You can't get a fragmented, dissolved, uncohesive armed group to smoothly demobilize or disarm or to reintegrate. So it had to be held together, and that was the big threat in a way. After the accord was rejected in the plebiscite, there were a lot of people who were very worried that the FARC would start to fall apart, that they couldn't. And so it was a very tenuous moment. That was one of the reasons why the renegotiation happened quickly, and why President Santos at the time used a different legal or constitutional mechanism through Congress to validate the renegotiated accord, because his argument in part was, if we don't do this now, this group, they won't be intact enough to be able to even disarm, which is as I say, it's like the critical goal, the minimum goal of negotiating with this group.
Right. Thank you. And so just to follow up on that, and I'd like to ask Camila de Gambo to comment on this. Following up on that, as the question indicates, there has nevertheless been a good deal of, not a huge amount, but a good deal of retaking up of arms, of rearmament among some factions, among some actors in the FARC. Camila, is it enough of a return by enough of the right kind of actors to make you concerned that FARC is in some way going to reconstitute itself, or do you think that this is just the foreseeable but not catastrophic lack of completeness of the demobilization and disarmament process?
Bien, bueno, igualmente, como en cualquier proceso de paz,
Just like in any peace process,
cualquier negociación,
in any negotiation,
hay algunos,
obviously,
miembros,
there are some
por un lado, que no se
members
desmovilizan,
that on one hand,
por el
they don't
otro lado,
demobilize, and on
algunos
the other hand, there are others who are dissidents, and they resume taking the arms. But I believe that I do understand the point of view of the comprehensive, not just as a transitional justice system vis-a-vis the institutions that belong to a system that indeed need to be comprehensive, that cooperate and are coordinated amongst themselves. And obviously all this gives a whole range of possibilities for these people not to go back being members of armed organizations. But on the other hand, I believe that we need to understand that this comprehensive system is a more general one, to understand the accord as a wholesome of something that is more comprehensive, so that indeed there's no repetition, so that no reincidence, so that these people can leave the war in criminal organizations and are really anchored in security. For this to happen, the other parts of the accord need to be implemented. So when we talk about these benefits of political participation, of course, they need to have this. They need to have guarantees and protection of when they do politics in regions or cities. If we're talking about illegal crops, of course, there needs to be a reform that allow people to have a way of life that is different than drug trafficking. And also the comprehensive land reform, just like Camilo has pointed out, is the origin of the conflict in Colombia, which has always been a conflict for the land. So what you can see many times is how rhetorics is used, like Camilo was saying, in which we always see the FARC as the enemy and the reason of all the evil in Colombia. But what we don't see is that precisely implementing the other parts of the accord is what would allow to remove the possibility for these people to go back, not just these people, but the potential number of female and male citizens that are a possibility and the best in adverse context to join armed groups. So I believe that part of the problem, which to me is terrible sometimes with the government discourse, is not to see that clarity that we already have an accord. And what we need to do is to implement it. So the efforts should be geared towards implementing it, and we would start seeing results. I'm not saying that the results are immediate, but we would see results in the medium and long term.
Thank you very much for that response, Camila. And just in closing, I wonder if we can look at this this question here by Jessica Angel, who asks, how do we know when transitional justice in Colombia is over and has been fulfilled? It's actually a great question, I think. And I wonder if we can just end, we have 5 minutes left. I wonder if we can just end very briefly by having all of you address yourselves to that question just for a minute or two. And maybe we can start with Mariana.
I would say that we could start by Mark. No, but I think that there's very obvious objectives. There's the sentences of the most responsible for the most atrocious crimes, a response to what happened, and the several elements that I was mentioning in a previous intervention. The reparation of victims, providing for the reparation of victims, and giving some kind of relief to the pain of the families of the people deemed missing within the framework of the armed conflict. But there's also, besides those very specific and very obvious objectives, there's wider ones, of course. What do you want as a result of transitional justice? You actually want to address the rights of the victims and to allow and conduct society into confronting their past, but also building a new future in an inclusive and more democratic way. And those are, of course, huge and super ambitious objectives, which would be, I don't know how you can measure that. But even, and in fact, and I just finish with this, because even when we were working on reparations from the victims unit, we started working on reparations and collective reparations with a lot of excitement, a lot of commitment. We started building the diagnosis of harm, the plans for reparation, implementing the measures. And then we started thinking, so when do we understand that the plan is closed? When do we understand, okay, that community has been repaired, comprehensively repaired? And these are still questions that the institutionality is still facing, and I do believe that those questions are open for debate, for huge debate.
Thank you. Camilo, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I believe that this is the big question. I believe that when the automatic response to political conflicts is not violence, and when looking back to the past is not as painful, I believe that those are going to be the great measurements of what we have achieved. I believe that we still have many logistics of violence and violence justification in order to negotiate many conflicts in Colombia that prove that it's necessary for us to face with an amount of measures our past and our present. As long as there's not an automatic response, because Colombia has had a pilot for automatic response. Perhaps violence still exists, but when it's not an automatic pilot, I believe that we can say that we have achieved, we've done our job. And also, I believe that the atrocity that we have experienced is not going to leave us, and perhaps it shouldn't. And I don't think that we're going to erase the past. I believe that the I don't believe that that's the goal of the Truth Commission. But if we're able to process all this that we have experienced, and we're able to understand and not retake again the pain path, I believe that that day we would have achieved our goals. I don't think that it's necessary to have all crimes prosecuted by the JEP. And unfortunately, not that all the missing people have gone back to their homes or know their whereabouts. But when we collectively are taking that same path, I believe that that's when we could say we graduated from transitional justice.
Thank you, Camilo. Mark, a closing thought from you?
I mean, I think what everybody has said, those are very elegant answers to a possibly deep philosophical question. Max, you're probably the best placed of us all as a philosophy professor, but you know, I mean, I would say two things. To build in a different direction that I think is complementary to what's already been said. One, that as long as there is a standing injustice in the minds of one or more groups in society, I think it will always feel unfinished, at least for some part of the population. And that can, I mean, let's think about, you know, the Armenians and how they feel about Turkey, or, you know, after the last survivor of the Shoah dies, and how Jews may feel about Germany or whatever for a long period to come. So I think, in a sense, it can be done, but time does that final bit of healing, I would say. In another way, I guess, to take a more skeptical stance in the immediate time, I can't but think of a case like former Yugoslavia, not because of its similarity for Colombia, but for this specific lesson that you can investigate and prosecute and convict all of the major leaders of all of the major sides, and do that to the highest standard, to a Cadillac standard of justice over decades, with almost unlimited budget and the support of many victims. And at the end of that, find historical revisionism on the increase, polarization on the increase, a sense of injustice magnified. So I think why I mention that is that there has to be dialogue about transitional justice while the mechanisms are acting. There have to be deep conversations that are inclusive, where sides aren't constantly seeking to delegitimize the other in one way or another, because without parallel dialogues about the meaning of and the point of the whole exercise, you could wake up 20 years after doing everything right according to the Cadillac standard, and you're in a worse position in terms of the basic goals that you might have of eliminating the seeds of violence, and, you know, having some sense of coexistence and reconciliation for future generations.
Thank you. Camila, last thought?
Gracias, Camila. ¿Algún último pensamiento?
Bien, pues yo creería, digamos,
I would think
en el inmediato plazo, pues
that
obviamente
at
la
the
idea es
short term, the idea would obviously be to be able to implement the agreements. What you look for is that negotiation models that are properly done, that have a democratic goal, are the democratic processes in themselves, which means I agree with Mark's idea that needs dialogue. And these mechanisms somehow challenge us and make us reflect on our own place in society our own responsibility to what happened. And I think that's very important. It's important that the position that civil society may take, which has not been fully involved in the conflict, that may have lived it in somewhat indirectly as compared to some other cases where people may have been victims of what happens in an armed conflict. But this is when society can reflect critically about its past and understand that what happened cannot happen again, to understand that there is political, moral, legal responsibility in a number of decisions that many times are collective, but also personal, about what was done at a particular time on the day that, as Colombians, we can actually face it this way and we don't justify, and we can look at it objectively, then we can say we're on the other side.
Thank you so much, Camila. Thank you all of the panelists, Camila de Gambo, Camilo Sanchez, Mariana Kastic, and Mark Freeman. Thank you for a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much to Nancy and Ana Maria, our two interpreters, for their hard work during this hour and a half, and to you audience members. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. A reminder that these webinars are monthly. Stay tuned for our next installment, which will be in the middle of January, where we will have a two-part webinar on 2 different days. We'll be announcing those dates soon. They will be analyzing what to hope for, what to expect in terms of atrocity prevention in a Biden-Harris administration. The first of those will be focusing on America's international obligations and responsibilities and how they can be repaired after the calamitous damage done to both the State Department and to our multilateral and international relationships. The second part will be focused on domestic issues and how domestic atrocity prevention really has become, in a long overdue way, a topic that we have to talk about within our borders as well, and should have been for some time. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it very much. Be safe, be well. I hope you enjoy a restful and healthy end of the year, and a very happy new year to you all. And we hope to see you again in January. So goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Gracias, Max.
Max,
Thank
muchas
you.
gracias.
Hasta luego.